On the morning of June 27th, 1977, a nurse named Mildred Garvue arrived at work just before 7. Her shift was supposed to begin like any other. She would check on her patient, an elderly heiress confined to a wheelchair after a devastating stroke. She would review the notes left by the night nurse. She would prepare breakfast and begin another quiet day in one of the most beautiful mansions in America. But when Mildred reached the front door of Glensheen Mansion, something felt wrong. The door was unlocked. In a house that had stood for nearly 70 years, where servants and nurses followed strict routines, an unlocked door at dawn was unusual. She turned the brass handle and stepped inside. The grand foyer was silent. Morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across polished oak floors. Mildred walked toward the kitchen to speak with the cook, but something caught her eye. On the landing of the grand staircase, she saw her friend and fellow nurse, Velma Piatila, lying awkwardly on the window seat. At first, Mildred thought Velma had fallen asleep. The night shift could be exhausting, and perhaps she had simply rested her eyes for a moment. But as Mildred climbed the stairs, the truth revealed itself in horrifying detail. Velma was not sleeping. She was dead. Her face was bloody and swollen. Her skull had been crushed by repeated blows from a heavy brass candlestick that still lay nearby, its ornate surface now stained with evidence of violence. Mildred's screams echoed through the empty mansion as she rushed upstairs, her heart pounding with a terrible certainty about what she would find. In the master bedroom, 83-year-old Elizabeth Congdon lay motionless in her bed. A satin pillow covered her face. She had been smothered to death while she slept, helpless and unable to call for help. What happened that night in the Grandest mansion in Minnesota? Who climbed through a broken basement window, crept up the service stairs, and committed one of the most shocking murders in American history? The answer would take years to unravel, and it would reveal a story of greed, manipulation, and a family fortune worth $8 million. But to understand how this tragedy came to pass, we must first understand the family that built Glensheen and the legacy they left behind. The story begins not with murder, but with ambition. In 1892, a young lawyer named Chester Adgate Congdon arrived in Duluth, Minnesota, with his wife Clara and dreams of building something extraordinary. Chester had been born in Rochester, New York, the son of a Methodist minister. He met Clara Bannister at Syracuse University, where both of them were the children of religious families who valued education, hard work, and moral integrity. After graduating in 1875, Chester struggled to establish himself. He took a teaching position in Wisconsin, then moved to St. Paul to open a law practice. Success came slowly at first, but Chester possessed two qualities that would change everything. He was patient, and he was brilliant at recognizing opportunity. In the early 1890s, the Mesabi Iron Range in northern Minnesota was about to transform the American economy. Beneath the forests and swamps of this remote region lay billions of tons of iron ore, the raw material that would fuel the Industrial Revolution and make fortunes for those bold enough to claim it. Chester saw what was coming. He moved his family to Duluth and partnered with fellow attorney William Bilson. The pair was hired to represent the Oliver Mining Company in negotiations that would determine who controlled the richest iron deposits in North America. On one side stood John D. Rockefeller, the oil baron who wanted to dominate mining as he had dominated petroleum. On the other side stood Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate who needed iron ore to feed his factories. Chester Congdon convinced his clients to align with Carnegie, a decision that would shape the future of American industry. The negotiations were fierce and complex, drawing national attention to Minnesota. When the dust settled, Chester had helped orchestrate deals that would eventually consolidate into United States Steel, the largest corporation the world had ever seen. Along the way, he purchased significant tracts of land on the Iron Range, leasing mineral rights to the growing mines. His legal fees and investments made him one of the wealthiest men in the upper Midwest. But Chester was not content simply to accumulate money. He believed that wealth carried responsibility. Throughout his life, he donated to hospitals, schools, and churches. He served in the Minnesota legislature, championing the construction of a scenic highway along the north shore of Lake Superior. He donated land for public parks, insisting that the natural beauty of the region should be preserved for everyone to enjoy. And in 1903, Chester and Clara began planning something personal. They would build a family home unlike anything Minnesota had ever seen. A home that would reflect their values, shelter their 6 children, and stand as a testament to what hard work and integrity could achieve. Chester selected a site 3 miles northeast of downtown Duluth, on a rugged forested bluff overlooking Lake Superior. The property stretched between 2 creeks, Tisher Creek to the west and Bent Brook to the east, creating a natural glen that seemed to shimmer in the northern light. Chester named the estate Glen Sheen, combining the Scottish word for a narrow valley with the name of his family's ancestral village in Surrey, England. Some said the name also honored the way sunlight danced on the lake below. To design his dream home, Chester hired Clarence H. Johnston, Minnesota's most respected architect. Johnston had created mansions along St. Paul's prestigious Summit Avenue, but this project would be his masterpiece. Working closely with Chester and Clara, he designed a 39-room mansion in the Jacobean Revival style, drawing inspiration from English country houses that had stood for 4 centuries. The exterior featured elegant red brick with granite trim, prominent gables, and tall chimneys that reached toward the Minnesota sky. The roofline was asymmetrical, creating a picturesque silhouette that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Large bay windows captured views of the lake, while covered porches provided shelter from the harsh northern winters. But it was the interior that truly set Glen Sheen apart. Chester hired William A. French, a St. Paul decorator known for his exquisite taste, to design every room. French chose materials that reflected both luxury and warmth. Silver for light fixtures, gold leaf for ceilings, Circassian walnut, mahogany, cypress, and fumed oak for the woodwork, Algerian marble for fireplaces. Each of the 15 bedrooms was trimmed in a different wood, with custom furniture crafted from the same material to create perfect harmony. The entrance hall greeted visitors with hand-carved oak paneling that seemed to glow from within. The wood had been fumed with ammonia to bring out its grain, then shellacked and waxed to preserve its angelic hue. Alabaster-topped chandeliers cast a golden halo across the space, while a grand staircase rose to the upper floors. Its railings carved with intricate designs that took craftsmen months to complete. The library overlooked terraced gardens that descended to the lake, its shelves filled with thousands of volumes that Chester actually read. Unlike many wealthy collectors who bought books for display, Chester was a true scholar who devoured history, politics, and architecture late into the night. A rotating bookcase in the adjacent office held his most treasured volumes, spinning silently to reveal hidden compartments. The dining room featured a chandelier so elaborate that servants nicknamed it the maid's nightmare because of how long it took to clean. The formal table could seat the entire Congdon family and guests for elegant dinners that often lasted hours, filled with lively conversation about politics, business, and the affairs of the day. But perhaps the most stunning room was the breakfast room, a jewel designed by Minneapolis craftsman John Bradstreet. The walls and floors were covered in emerald green rookwood pottery tiles that caught the morning light streaming through Art Nouveau windows. Oak leaves danced across the stained glass, while acid-treated Sugi wood furniture appeared black as coal, creating a nature-inspired sanctuary where the family gathered each morning to watch the sunrise over Lake Superior. The lower level housed practical spaces alongside leisure areas. A billiard room provided entertainment for guests, while a recreation room called the Little Museum displayed curiosities collected during the family's travels. The basement contained a milk room, laundry facilities with innovative drying chambers, and servants' quarters connected by tunnels that allowed staff to move unseen throughout the estate. Technologically, Glensheen was decades ahead of its time. The mansion had central heating with a sophisticated humidification system to protect the artwork and furniture from Minnesota's dry winters. A central vacuuming system ran through the walls. Both gas and electric lights were installed, since electricity was still unreliable in 1908. An intercom system allowed family members to summon servants from any room. Outside, landscape architect Charles Welford Levitt transformed the wild property into a self-sufficient estate. He designed formal gardens with terraces that descended toward the lake, a bowling green, walking paths lined with more than 30 species of trees, and footbridges that crossed the ravines. A 60,000-gallon reservoir diverted water from Tisher Creek to supply the estate, generating enough pressure to shoot fountain water 75 feet into the air. The property included a carriage house, a gardener's cottage, and a boathouse on Lake Superior that was the largest private pier on the entire lake, the only one marked on navigational maps. Underground tunnels carried all utilities from the road, so the landscaping would remain unmarred by wires or pipes. Every detail had been considered. Every element served both function and beauty. Construction took 3 years and cost $854,000, equivalent to more than $22 million today. When the Congdon family finally moved in during late November of 1908, they entered a home that represented not just wealth, but vision. Throughout the interior, symbols of power and hospitality appeared in the decorative elements. Lions represented strength. Pineapples represented welcome. Together, they sent a message to every visitor. The Congdons had arrived, and they intended to share their good fortune with the world. Chester lived only 8 years in his beloved home. On November 21, 1916, he suffered a pulmonary embolism in St. Paul and died at the age of 63. His vision for the North Shore Highway was completed 7 years later, connecting Duluth to Canada along the scenic route he had championed. Clara remained at Glensheen, hosting family gatherings and maintaining the traditions her husband had established. She died in 1950, leaving the estate to their youngest surviving daughter, a woman named Elizabeth. Elizabeth Mannering Congdon was born on April the 22nd, 1894, the sixth of Chester and Clara's 7 children. Unlike her more social siblings, Elizabeth was quiet and reserved, preferring books and gardens to parties and travel. She never married, choosing instead to devote herself to charitable work and the management of Glensheen. In 1932, Elizabeth did something unusual for a single woman of that era. She adopted an infant girl named Jacqueline Barnes and renamed her Marjorie Mannering Congdon. 3 years later, she adopted a second daughter, Jennifer Susan Congdon. Elizabeth raised both girls in the grandeur of Glensheen, surrounded by servants, private tutors, and the expectations that came with being a Congdon. From the outside, It seemed like a fairy tale. Two orphaned children rescued by a wealthy heiress, given every advantage money could buy, raised in a mansion on the shores of Lake Superior. But behind the elegant facade, darkness was growing. One of those adopted daughters would eventually be suspected of plotting her mother's murder. And the $8 million inheritance waiting at the end would set in motion one of the most twisted, true crime stories in American history. Marjorie Congdon was trouble from the start. Even as a child, she showed signs of something wrong. She lied frequently and skillfully. She manipulated adults to get what she wanted. She spent money recklessly, running up bills that her adoptive mother dutifully paid. When confronted about her behavior, Marjorie could be charming and apologetic, promising to change. But the promises never lasted. As Marjorie grew into adulthood, her pattern of deception became more sophisticated. She married her first husband, Dick Leroy, and had 7 children with him over the course of their 20-year marriage. But even motherhood could not cure what ailed her. She continued to spend beyond her means, bouncing checks and trusting that her mother would cover the debts. She bought extravagant clothing, dozens of matching outfits for her children, horses, and luxury items that depleted her $1 million trust fund. Elizabeth tried to help her daughter. Time after time, she bailed Marjorie out of financial trouble, hoping that this would be the last time, that Marjorie would finally learn responsibility. But the spending only accelerated. By the mid-1970s, Marjorie had exhausted her trust fund entirely. She divorced Dick Leroy and moved to Colorado, seeking a fresh start far from the disapproving eyes of her family. In 1975, at a Parents Without Partners meeting, Marjorie met a man named Roger Caldwell. He was tall, good-looking, and available. He was also an alcoholic with a history of violence when he drank. But Marjorie saw something in him that others missed. Perhaps she saw someone she could control. Perhaps she saw a willing accomplice for what was to come. They married in 1976, and almost immediately, their financial troubles began. Marjorie continued her extravagant spending despite having no income. Roger was unemployed. They purchased property for a horse ranch, but could not make the payments, losing it to foreclosure. They bought a $5,000 horse for Marjorie's teenage son, Rick. They spent $3,500 on turquoise jewelry and $5,100 on a vacation at a mountain resort. Meanwhile, back in Duluth, Elizabeth Congdon had suffered a devastating stroke. She was confined to a wheelchair, paralyzed on one side, requiring round-the-clock nursing care. She could no longer manage her own affairs, so the Congdon family trustees took control of her fortune, distributing income carefully and responsibly. When Marjorie came calling for money, the trustees said no. They had watched her drain her trust fund. They had seen how she manipulated her mother. They refused to enable her any longer. The Bank of Mother was closed. But Marjorie was not easily deterred. In May of 1977, she sent Roger to Duluth to plead their case in person. He carried 2 letters from Rick's doctor, claiming that the boy had cystic fibrosis and needed to live on a ranch for his health. One of the letters would later be proven to be a forgery. Roger asked the trustees for $750,000 to buy a ranch and $50,000 to pay their debts. The trustees refused. The Caldwells grew more desperate. Their cars were repossessed. They lost their home and moved into the Holland House Hotel in Golden, Colorado. A gas station attendant confiscated their credit card, which had been fraudulently obtained in the name of Elizabeth Congdon. They pawned jewelry and received $3,000, which they used to pay overdue bills. And yet, Even as they spiraled toward bankruptcy, Marjorie continued looking at real estate. She toured multi-million-dollar ranches, telling realtors that her mother would handle the purchase because the mountain air would be good for Rick's asthma. She was planning something. She was waiting for something. On June 24th, 1977, just 3 days before the murders, Marjorie signed a notarized document. The paper stated that upon her mother's death, Roger Caldwell would receive approximately $2.5 million of Marjorie's $8 million inheritance. It was a promise of payment for services yet to be rendered. A contract sealed in anticipation of blood. That same weekend, something strange happened in the cemetery that bordered the Glensheen estate. A groundskeeper noticed a man lurking among the headstones after dark, pacing nervously, occasionally taking nips from a bottle. The man seemed to be watching the mansion, studying its windows, timing its routines. The groundskeeper thought it was odd, but did not report it. On the night of June 26, 1977, Velma Piatila arrived at Glensheen to begin her shift as night nurse. She had recently retired after years of caring for Elizabeth, but she had agreed to fill in for a colleague who had requested the evening off. Her husband begged her not to go. He had a bad feeling about that night. But Velma was loyal, and she did not want to leave Elizabeth without care. Sometime after midnight, an intruder broke a pane of glass in a basement window near the billiard room. He climbed through, leaving a footprint on the sofa below. He crept through the lower level, past the servants' quarters where staff members slept, up the service stairs toward the second floor where Elizabeth lay sleeping. Velma heard something, a sound that did not belong. She left Elizabeth's room to investigate, walking toward the grand staircase where light from the moon streamed through tall windows. She never saw the blow coming. The killer struck her with a brass candlestick, a heavy decorative piece that had adorned a table near the stairs. Velma fought back. Despite being 67 years old and surprised from behind, she struggled against her attacker. The battle moved from the top of the staircase down to the landing, where she finally collapsed after 23 brutal blows to her head. Her left wrist was bound with a dark nylon stocking, suggesting that the killer had intended to tie her up rather than murder her. But Velma had fought too hard. She had refused to go quietly. With the nurse dead, the killer climbed to Elizabeth's bedroom. The elderly heiress lay helpless in her bed, unable to move, unable to scream. He took a satin pillow and pressed it over her face. Elizabeth Congdon, the last surviving child of Chester and Clara, the woman who had inherited their fortune and their dream, died alone in the darkness. The killer ransacked the room, searching for jewelry and valuables. He found a rare Byzantine gold coin that had belonged to the family for generations. He stuffed it in his pocket along with other treasures. Then he located Velma's car keys and drove her vehicle to the Minneapolis airport, abandoning it in the short-term parking lot. He caught an early morning flight and disappeared. By 7 that morning, when Mildred Garview discovered the bodies, the killer was already hundreds of miles away. But he had made mistakes. He had left fingerprints. He had been seen by witnesses, and he had mailed himself a package that would become the most damning evidence of all. Within hours of the discovery, investigators began to suspect that this was no random burglary gone wrong. The evidence pointed in one direction, toward Colorado, toward a desperate couple drowning in debt, toward a daughter who stood to inherit $8 million upon her mother's death. The hunt for the killer of Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Piatila had begun, and it would lead investigators into a web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal that would take years to untangle. The question was not simply who committed the murders. The question was whether the mastermind behind them would ever face justice. When word of the murders reached Elizabeth's family, suspicion fell immediately on Marjorie. Her younger sister, Jennifer, upon learning of the deaths, reportedly said 4 words that would echo throughout the investigation. Marjorie did it. The family had watched Marjorie's behavior for decades. They knew about the spending, the lies, the manipulation. They knew about the marmalade incident years earlier, when Elizabeth had become mysteriously ill after eating homemade orange marmalade that Marjorie had brought to a family gathering. Tests had shown dangerous chemicals in Elizabeth's blood, but the marmalade jar was never found and authorities were not notified. Now Elizabeth was dead, and Marjorie stood to inherit millions. The family urged police to look closely at the adopted daughter and her new husband. Investigators from the Duluth Police Department fanned out across the city, searching for witnesses, collecting evidence, building a timeline of the killer's movements. They found a cab driver who remembered picking up a passenger at the Greyhound bus depot between 11:30 and midnight on the night of the murder. The passenger had asked to be driven down London Road, past Glensheen Mansion, to a spot about 5 blocks beyond the estate. The cab driver would later identify Roger Caldwell from a police lineup. At the Minneapolis airport, workers discovered a set of car keys in a trash receptacle. The keys bore a tag with Velma Piatila's name. A parking lot ticket stamped 6:35 that morning was found nearby. Velma's car sat in the short-term lot, abandoned by someone who had fled the scene. Meanwhile, in Colorado, strange things were happening. Marjorie was seen looking at real estate on the day she learned of her mother's death. Roger appeared at a bank the day after the murders, opening a safe deposit box with disheveled hair and visible injuries to his face and hands. When asked about the cuts and bruises, he claimed he had been kicked by a horse. But witnesses who had seen him 2 days earlier reported that he had shown no such injuries then. Inside that safe deposit box, investigators would later find the notarized document that Marjorie had signed 3 days before the murders, promising Roger $2.5 million of her inheritance. They would also find something else, something that would tie Roger Caldwell directly to the crime scene at Glensheen. A rare Byzantine gold coin, stolen from Elizabeth Congdon's bedroom on the night of her death, had been mailed from Minneapolis to Roger Caldwell's address in Colorado. The envelope bore a fingerprint that matched Roger's own. It was as if the killer had sent himself a trophy, a souvenir of his crime, without realizing that the package would become the key to his conviction. The investigation was moving forward, but the most difficult questions remained unanswered. How had Roger traveled from Colorado to Minnesota without leaving any record of his journey? Why had he mailed himself the stolen coin instead of simply carrying it home? And most importantly, what role had Marjorie played in planning the murders of her own mother and the innocent nurse who had been caught in the crossfire? As summer turned to fall in 1977, the people of Minnesota watched and waited. Justice for Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Piatila depended on whether investigators could untangle the web of deception that Marjorie Caldwell had spent a lifetime weaving. The trial that followed would become one of the most sensational in the state's history, filled with twists, turns, and a verdict that would shock the nation. On July 6, 1977, just 9 days after the murders at Glensheen Mansion, police arrested Roger Caldwell in Colorado. The evidence against him was mounting. A cab driver had placed him in Duluth on the night of the killings. His fingerprint had been found on an envelope containing a stolen Byzantine gold coin mailed from Minneapolis. He had appeared at a bank the day after the murders with unexplained injuries to his face and hands. And in his safe deposit box, investigators discovered the notarized document promising him $2.5 million of Marjorie's inheritance, signed just 3 days before Elizabeth Congdon's death. 5 days later, on July 11th, Marjorie Caldwell was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder and aiding and abetting the deaths of her adoptive mother and Velma Piatila. The daughter who had spent her entire life manipulating her way out of trouble now faced the ultimate reckoning. If convicted, she could spend the rest of her life in prison. The case against the Caldwells electrified Minnesota. Newspapers devoted front pages to every development. Television crews camped outside courthouses. The story had everything the public craved: wealth, greed, family betrayal, and a magnificent mansion that now stood as a monument to murder. It was the kind of case that became legend, whispered about in coffee shops and debated around dinner tables across the state. Because of the intense publicity in Duluth, Roger Caldwell's trial was moved to Crow Wing County, more than 100 miles southwest. The proceedings began in the spring of 1978, and from the first day, the courtroom was packed with spectators hungry for drama. Prosecutor John DeSanto methodically built his case. He presented the fingerprint evidence, showing that Roger's print had been found on the envelope containing the stolen coin. He called the cab driver who had driven a passenger to London Road on the night of the murders and identified Roger Caldwell as that passenger. He introduced the notarized document from the safe deposit box, arguing that it proved Roger had a financial motive to kill Elizabeth Congdon. He showed the jury photographs of Roger's injuries, the cuts and bruises that appeared overnight, injuries consistent with a violent struggle. The defense fought back fiercely. Roger's attorneys argued that the fingerprint evidence was inconclusive, that someone could have planted the envelope to frame their client. They pointed out that no airline records placed Roger on any flight between Denver and Minneapolis. They noted that despite extensive searches, police had never found the murder weapon or bloody clothing in Roger's possession. They suggested that the real killer remained at large, that Roger Caldwell was simply a convenient scapegoat. But the jury was not persuaded. On July 8, 1978, after deliberating for several days, they returned their verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Roger Caldwell was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. As deputies led him away in handcuffs, he showed no emotion. The man who had beaten Velma Piatila to death with a brass candlestick and smothered an elderly woman in her bed would spend the rest of his days behind bars, or so everyone thought. Marjorie Caldwell's trial began in 1979, moved to Dakota County to avoid the publicity that had surrounded her husband's case. She hired Ron Meshbesher, one of the most respected criminal defense attorneys in Minnesota, a man known for his brilliant courtroom tactics and his ability to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. From the beginning, Meshbesher pursued a simple strategy. He would put the prosecution's case on trial rather than his client. He attacked every piece of evidence, every witness, every assumption the state had made. He pointed out that Marjorie had been in Colorado on the night of the murders, hundreds of miles from Glen Sheen. He argued that there was no direct evidence linking her to the crime, only circumstantial connections and the testimony of witnesses who had their own reasons to lie. The prosecution countered with evidence of Marjorie's financial desperation, her history of manipulating her mother for money, and the suspicious timing of the notarized document promising Roger a share of the inheritance. They painted a picture of a woman who had masterminded the murders from afar, using her husband as the instrument of her greed. But Meshbesher was relentless. He hammered away at inconsistencies in the state's case. He raised questions about the fingerprint evidence that had convicted Roger. He suggested that someone else might have committed the murders and framed both Caldwells. He reminded the jury again and again that the burden of proof rested with the prosecution, and that if they had any reasonable doubt about Marjorie's guilt, they must acquit. The trial lasted for weeks, filled with dramatic testimony and heated exchanges between attorneys. When it finally went to the jury, no one knew what to expect. The evidence against Marjorie was entirely circumstantial. She had not been present at the crime scene. She had not confessed. The only direct link between her and the murders was her relationship with Roger and her obvious financial motive. The jury deliberated for days. When they finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was unbearable. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict: not guilty. Marjorie Caldwell walked out of the courthouse a free woman. She had beaten the charges that had destroyed her husband's life. She had escaped justice for what many believed was the murder of her own mother. The acquittal stunned Minnesota. How could a woman so obviously connected to the crime walk away without consequence? How could the justice system fail so completely? But Marjorie's freedom came with a price. Her reputation was destroyed. Her family wanted nothing to do with her. 5 of her 7 children filed a civil lawsuit to disinherit her, arguing that she should not profit from murders she had helped plan. The lawsuit was settled out of court in 1983, with Marjorie receiving far less than the $8 million she had expected. Instead of a fortune, she ended up with roughly $40,000 per year from a Congdon trust, a fraction of what she had killed for. Meanwhile, Roger Caldwell sat in prison, serving 2 life sentences for crimes his wife had allegedly orchestrated. His attorneys continued to fight, filing appeals based on evidence that had emerged during Marjorie's trial. They argued that the fingerprint on the envelope had been contested by experts, that the cab driver's identification was tainted because he had seen Roger's photograph in newspapers before the lineup. They presented new witnesses and new theories that cast doubt on the original verdict. In 1982, the Minnesota Supreme Court did something extraordinary. They overturned Roger Caldwell's conviction and ordered a new trial. The evidence, they ruled, was not as solid as the jury had believed. New information had come to light that could change everything. Prosecutors faced a difficult choice. They could retry Roger with the same problematic evidence, risking another lengthy trial and possible acquittal. Or they could offer a deal. After months of negotiation, they chose the deal. On July 5, 1983, Roger Caldwell stood before a judge and confessed to the murders of Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Piatila. In exchange for his guilty plea to second-degree murder, he would be sentenced to time served. After 5 years in prison, he would walk free. The confession was detailed and chilling. Roger admitted that he had traveled to Duluth on the night of June 26, 1977. He admitted that he had broken into Glensheen Mansion through a basement window. He admitted that he had encountered Velma Piatila on the staircase and beaten her to death when she refused to cooperate. He admitted that he had smothered Elizabeth Congdon with a satin pillow as she lay helpless in her bed. But Roger refused to implicate Marjorie. When asked directly whether his wife had helped plan the murders, he declined to answer. He would confess to his own crimes, but he would not betray the woman he had loved, even after she had abandoned him, even after she had stopped visiting him in prison, even after she had married another man without bothering to divorce him first. Roger Caldwell was released from prison in the summer of 1983. He returned to a world that wanted nothing to do with him, a confessed murderer with no job, no family, and no future. He drifted through the following years, haunted by what he had done, unable to escape the shadow of Glensheen. On May 18, 1988, Roger Caldwell took his own life. He was found in a small apartment, dead from suicide. He was 55 years old. In death, as in life, he kept Marjorie's secrets. He never publicly accused her of planning the murders. He never explained why he had mailed himself the stolen coin or how he had traveled to Minnesota without leaving a trace. He took those answers to his grave. Years later, prosecutor John DeSanto had the envelope with Roger's fingerprint tested using DNA technology that had not existed during the original trial. The results confirmed what investigators had always believed. The DNA was a 99% match for Roger Caldwell. He had indeed mailed himself the Byzantine coin stolen from Elizabeth Congdon's bedroom. The evidence that had convicted him was real. But what about Marjorie? She had escaped the murder charges, but she could not escape herself. In the years following her acquittal, she continued the pattern of deception and destruction that had defined her entire life. Without divorcing Roger, she married an old family friend named Wallace Hagan in 1982. When authorities discovered the bigamy, she was charged, but the case was eventually dropped. She moved with Hagan to Minnesota, where they purchased a home together. In 1984, that home burned to the ground under suspicious circumstances. Investigators determined that the fire had been deliberately set. Marjorie was convicted of arson and sentenced to prison. Wallace Hagan, who had believed in her innocence, who had married her despite knowing her history, died in 1992 while she was behind bars. His death was ruled suspicious by some who knew the family, though no charges were ever filed. After her release from the Minnesota prison, Marjorie moved to Arizona, perhaps hoping that distance would give her a fresh start. It did not. In 1992, she was convicted of attempted arson again and sentenced to 15 years in an Arizona prison. She had tried to burn down another property for insurance money, repeating the same crime that had already cost her years of freedom. Even prison could not contain Marjorie's schemes. After her release in 2004, she settled in Tucson and almost immediately began manipulating new victims. She befriended an elderly man named Roger Samus, became his caretaker, and obtained power of attorney over his affairs. When Samus died, she was caught trying to deposit his inheritance into her own bank account. In 2007, Marjorie was charged with fraud, theft, forgery, and computer tampering. The case dragged on for years, delayed by health issues and legal maneuvering. She was eventually convicted and faced additional prison time, though her advanced age complicated sentencing. Throughout it all, Marjorie maintained her innocence regarding her mother's murder. She never admitted involvement. She never expressed remorse. She never acknowledged the destruction she had caused to so many lives. Her own children, 5 of whom had sued to disinherit her, remained estranged. The Congdon family wanted nothing to do with the woman who had brought such shame upon their name. As the years passed, Marjorie became a figure of dark fascination. Books were written about her crimes. Television documentaries explored the Glensheen murders. A musical was produced, dramatizing the events of that terrible night in 1977. People who had never heard of Elizabeth Congdon or Velma Pietola learned their names through the infamy of Marjorie Caldwell. And what of Glensheen itself? The mansion that had witnessed such horror became, paradoxically, one of Minnesota's greatest treasures. In 1968, before the murders, the Congdon family had already arranged to donate Glensheen to the University of Minnesota Duluth. Elizabeth was granted a life estate, allowing her to remain in her beloved home until her death. When she was murdered in 1977, the university took possession of the property, uncertain what to do with a crime scene of such notoriety. For 2 years, Glen Sheen sat silent. The bloodstains were cleaned. The broken window was repaired. The brass candlestick that had killed Velma Piatila was removed as evidence. Slowly, carefully, the mansion was prepared for a new purpose. In the summer of 1979, Glen Sheen opened its doors to the public as a historic house museum. At first, tour guides were instructed not to speak of the murders. The university wanted visitors to appreciate the architecture, the craftsmanship, the history of the Congdon family's role in building Minnesota's iron industry. They did not want Glen Sheen to become a morbid attraction for true crime enthusiasts, but the murders could not be erased. Visitors came with questions. They wanted to see the staircase where Velma had fought for her life. They wanted to stand in the bedroom where Elizabeth had taken her last breath. The tragedy had become inseparable from the beauty, woven into the fabric of the mansion itself. Over time, the university embraced a more honest approach. Today, visitors can learn about both the grandeur and the darkness of Glen Sheen's history. They can walk through 39 rooms filled with original furnishings, marvel at the emerald green breakfast room with its rookwood tiles, admire the hand-carved oak staircase where such violence once occurred. They can explore the formal gardens that descend to Lake Superior, visit the carriage house and boathouse, and imagine life in the early 20th century when Chester and Clara Congdon hosted elegant parties for Duluth's elite. Glen Sheen has become the most visited historic home in Minnesota, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Some come for the architecture. Some come for the gardens. Some come because they have read about the murders and want to experience the setting for themselves. Whatever brings them through the gates, most leave with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the place, the layers of history that make old houses more than just buildings. The mansion stands today almost exactly as it did when Elizabeth Congdon lived there. The furniture remains in the same positions. The artwork hangs on the same walls. Chester's top hat still sits in his closet. Clara's piano still stands in the parlor. More than a century after the Congdons moved in, their home endures as a testament to their vision and their values. But it also endures as a reminder that wealth cannot protect against human weakness. That family bonds can be twisted by greed into something unrecognizable. That even the most beautiful places can harbor the darkest secrets. Elizabeth Congdon deserved better than the death she received. She had devoted her life to charity, to caring for her adopted daughters, to maintaining the home her parents had built with such love. She did not deserve to be smothered in her bed by a man sent to kill her for money. She did not deserve to have her final moments filled with terror and betrayal. Velma Piatila deserved better too. She had already retired. She had earned her rest after years of faithful service. She only returned to Glen Sheen that night as a favor to a colleague. Her husband had begged her not to go. If she had listened, she would have lived to see her grandchildren grow up. Instead, she died on a staircase, fighting against an attacker she could not defeat, refusing to surrender even when all hope was lost. Their graves lie in cemeteries far from Glen Sheen, but their spirits seem to linger in the mansion they called home. Visitors sometimes report strange feelings on the grand staircase, a sense of presence in Elizabeth's bedroom. Whether these are ghosts or simply the weight of history pressing down on those who know the story, no one can say for certain. Marjorie Caldwell Hagen, as she was known after her marriages, lived into her late 80s. She spent her final years in Arizona, far from the cold shores of Lake Superior, far from the mansion where her mother died, far from the family that had disowned her. She never returned to Glen Sheen. She never made peace with her children. She never admitted what she had done. Some called her a sociopath, a person without conscience who manipulated everyone around her for personal gain. Others called her a psychopath, someone fundamentally incapable of empathy or remorse. Whatever label applies, Marjorie Caldwell represented something frightening about human nature. The capacity for evil that can hide behind a charming smile, the willingness to destroy even those closest to us in pursuit of what we want. The $8 million inheritance that motivated the murders was largely lost. Legal fees consumed much of the estate. The civil lawsuit stripped Marjorie of her expected fortune. Roger received nothing for his crimes except years in prison and a death by his own hand. The money that Elizabeth Congdon had carefully preserved, the wealth that Chester had earned through decades of hard work, scattered like leaves in the wind. What remains is the mansion itself. Stone and brick and wood and glass, assembled more than a century ago by craftsmen who took pride in their work. Rooms filled with beauty and memory, a grand staircase where blood once pooled and screams once echoed. A bedroom where an old woman closed her eyes for the last time. Glensheen endures because some things are stronger than the evil that touches them. The vision of Chester and Clara Congdon survives in every carefully chosen detail, every lovingly preserved artifact. The dedication of the university staff who maintain the property ensures that future generations will be able to experience its magnificence. The hundreds of thousands of visitors who pass through each year carry pieces of the story with them, keeping it alive in collective memory. If you ever find yourself in Duluth, Minnesota, driving along London Road toward the North Shore, you will see the mansion rising on the bluff above Lake Superior. Its red brick glows warm in the northern light. Its windows reflect the endless blue of the greatest of the Great Lakes. Its gardens bloom with the same flowers that Clara Congdon planted more than 100 years ago. Stop and visit. Walk through the rooms where history unfolded. Stand on the terrace and look out at the lake that Chester loved so much. He built his dream home on its shores. Listen to the stories the guides tell about iron ore fortunes and Gilded Age elegance. But also remember the other story, the darker one. The story of a daughter who could not be satisfied with what she had been given. The story of a husband who committed murder for a promise of money he would never receive. The story of two innocent women whose lives ended in violence on a summer night when the sun barely set over the northern horizon. Glensheen is all of these things. A masterpiece of architecture, a museum of Minnesota history, a crime scene preserved in amber. A warning about what happens when greed consumes the human heart. The mansion keeps its secrets now, as it has for nearly half a century since that terrible morning when Mildred Garview walked through an unlocked door and discovered what waited inside. The walls that witnessed murder now witness only tourists with cameras and school children on field trips. The staircase where Velma Piatila fought for her life now echoes with the footsteps of visitors who pause to imagine what happened there. Time has softened the horror, but not erased it. The beauty of Glensheen and the tragedy of the murders exist together, inseparable, two sides of the same story. And that story, like the mansion itself, endures. The sun still rises over Lake Superior each morning, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The waves still lap against the shore below the estate. The wind still rustles through the trees that Chester and Clara planted so long ago, and Glensheen still stands, magnificent and haunted, a monument to dreams and to the darkness that sometimes shadows them. Each year on June 27th, Some who remember pause to reflect on what happened that night. The anniversary passes quietly now, without the media frenzy that once surrounded the case. Most of the people directly involved have passed away. The prosecutors and defense attorneys have retired or died. The witnesses have faded into history. Only the mansion remains as a physical connection to that summer night in 1977. The staff at Glensheen have become custodians not just of architecture, but of memory. They preserve the chandeliers and the woodwork, the gardens and the fountains, but they also preserve the truth of what happened within these walls. They tell both stories, the story of ambition and achievement, and the story of greed and murder. They understand that you cannot separate one from the other, that Glensheen's meaning comes from the totality of its history. Visitors leave the estate with different feelings. Some are awed by the beauty. Some are troubled by the violence. Some are simply grateful to have experienced a place so rich in history and so preserved against the erosion of time. All of them carry a piece of Glensheen with them when they go, a memory of standing where giants once walked and where tragedy once struck. The Congdon family fortune, built from iron ore and legal brilliance, has dispersed across generations. The name still carries weight in Minnesota, still evokes images of wealth and influence. But the direct line that connected Chester to Elizabeth ended in murder. The adopted daughter who should have carried the legacy forward instead destroyed it. The $8 million that motivated such terrible crimes brought happiness to no one. Perhaps that is the final lesson of Glensheen, that wealth without wisdom leads to ruin, that family bonds, once broken by betrayal, can never fully heal, that the most beautiful houses can hold the ugliest secrets, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, eventually finds a way to reveal the truth. This is the legacy of Minnesota's Grandest mansion. This is the story of the $8 million inheritance murder. This is Glensheen, where beauty and tragedy will be forever intertwined, where the ghosts of the past still walk the halls, and where the light still shimmers on the lake below, just as it did when Chester Congdon first saw this place and dreamed of building something that would last forever. He succeeded beyond his imagination. Glensheen has lasted, and so has its story.